So, what is history? Well, in history, we seek to gain a true understanding of the past. And this doesn't mean just to learn about certain facts that happened in the past. We want to know not only what happened, but we also want to understand why these things happened. And then we want to ask ourselves, what does it mean that these things happened? So, for example, we can talk about Columbus sailing to the New World. Of course, that happened, right? But the real question is, why did Columbus sail to the New World? And what is the significance of Columbus doing that? These are the type of deep questions that we seek to answer when we do history. But the real question is, how do we do this? How do we come to a true understanding of the past? Obviously, we can't just go back in time and see what actually happened, at least not yet. But there are some things that we can use to broaden our understanding of what happened. And these things that we use to understand the past are called historical sources. Sources are objects that give us information about the past. And these can be both books, they can be artifacts that we discover, they can be recorded speech, all sorts of stuff. But it's anything that gives us information about what happened in the past. And now there are two types of sources, primary sources and secondary sources. And understanding the difference between these two is very important. Primary sources are things from the time and the place that we are actually studying that give us information about that time or place. So they come straight from the period that we're trying to understand. So, for example, if we are trying to understand Columbus's journey across the Atlantic, and Columbus wrote a journal where he described why he was going and what it was like as he was crossing, that would be a primary source because it's coming directly from the time period and the place that we are studying. Other examples include letters between people from a certain time or place. It could be art from a particular time period. So if we're studying the Renaissance, all of those famous paintings from the Renaissance are primary sources that we can use. Also, ancient ruins, grave sites are things that archaeologists use to understand the distant past. All of those things that come directly from the period that we're studying are primary sources. Now, in contrast, there are secondary sources. And these are very useful for most people in understanding the past. These are things that other people have written about the past when they weren't actually there. So your history textbook, for example, is a secondary source. The guy who wrote your textbook, or the excerpts from the texts you'll be reading in this class, they were not actually in ancient Egypt. They have studied a bunch of primary sources. They've read the hieroglyphics, they've studied the pyramids, and using all of the primary sources, they have put together a secondary source that gives you a bunch of information really quickly. So secondary sources are very useful, but they are always already interpreted by somebody. Yes, so if the person who wrote the report was not there, it's a secondary source. So while we go on, you should be thinking about what are the pros and cons of different sources. What if we only had primary sources? Or what if we only had secondary sources? So what do we do with our historical sources? How do we use them? Obviously, you can't just line up a whole bunch of primary sources and secondary sources and understand the past, right? What you have to do is you have to interpret them. You have to interpret the historical sources if you want to answer all of the deep questions that we said historians ask. But what does it mean to interpret something? To interpret a source is to ask the question, what trustworthy information does this source give to me? So you can't just accept everything that a source says to you. You have to question it. You have to interrogate it. Kind of like the way you would interrogate, a criminal in one of those crime scene shows, right? The source is not always trustworthy. So you have to ask the right questions to get the right information out of it. So how do we do this? How do we ask the right questions? Well, first of all, we have to read the source very carefully. We can't just skim it, and we can't just take everything that it says at face value. We also have to be careful as we're reading for any hidden meaning or any information that might not be clear right away. One thing that's very important is to think about what the context is of the source. When was it written? Why was it written? Who was it written to? These questions, being aware of this stuff, will help us to interpret the source more effectively. Also, you need to ask what the perspective is of the person who's writing the source. So let's say that, again, we're looking at Columbus's journey across the Atlantic, and we're looking at his journal. And he says that the journey went fine and that there were no problems and that everybody was really happy the whole time while he was captain. Can we trust him on that? Is there a reason that Columbus might want us to think that the journey went well? Maybe because he's reporting back to the king and queen and he wants to convince them that he's a good captain? If there is a reason that a person would be interested to portray something in a certain way, we call this a bias. And so you always need to be aware when you're reading a source of whether or not there might be a bias present in the information that you're being given. You need to be careful, right? So let's say a historian 1,000 years from now was watching a Nike commercial trying to learn about shoes in our time period. If he watched the Nike commercial and was not very careful about interpreting the source correctly, he would come to the conclusion that Nikes are by far the best shoe that existed during our time period. But the Nike commercial is biased, so you have to watch out for that. So anyway, those are two keys to effective interpretation of historical sources. One, you have to read very carefully and pay attention to context and hidden meaning. And two, you have to watch out for bias. You have to make sure that you're paying attention to the hidden interests of the person who wrote the historical source you're looking at. So anyway, that's all for this. These are a couple key terms that you may be asked to define later on, so make sure you're aware of what these terms mean, and we'll be able to write down something about them later. That's all.